They had been trained to escape at the first real chance, to run the moment a gate was left open, and to believe that freedom was something you seized, not something you were given. But inside American prisoner of war camps, something unsettling happened when guards stepped back, rules loosened, and paths quietly opened. Because instead of running, many German prisoners stopped, hesitated, and did something no one expected at all. They stayed. From the moment German soldiers were taken prisoner, many carried with them a clear and almost mechanical understanding of what captivity was supposed to be, because their training, their experience, and even the stories passed between units had painted imprisonment as a rigid system built on constant supervision, visible authority, and strict enforcement. Guards would watch. Orders would be shouted. Boundaries would be unmistakable. They expected fences reinforced by fear, gates that symbolized finality, and routines designed to remind them, every hour of every day, that freedom had been taken and replaced by control. In that expectation, there was a strange comfort because an oppressive system is still a system, and systems can be learned, predicted, and endured. For many of them, captivity was imagined as a waiting room for escape, a temporary condition that demanded patience and obedience only until the right moment arrived. The idea of leaving without resistance, without chaos, and without pursuit did not fit within that mental framework, because freedom was supposed to be earned through risk, not offered quietly through absence. What unsettled them later was not the fences themselves, but how little attention those fences sometimes received. The physical structures were present, yet the pressure they symbolized began to feel oddly reduced, as if the environment no longer insisted on reminding them where they stood. Guards were still there, but their presence felt distant, routine-driven, and increasingly uninterested in constant enforcement. At first, this was interpreted as confidence rather than negligence, because the assumption was simple. A system this relaxed must be backed by consequences severe enough to remain invisible. Prisoners continued to behave cautiously, not because they were being watched closely, but because they believed that any misstep would trigger a response they simply could not yet see. Yet beneath that caution, something quieter began to form. The expectation of struggle, of tension, of clearly defined opposition did not match the reality unfolding around them. And without realizing it, many prisoners found themselves facing a situation they had never trained for at all. A captivity where escape did not feel forbidden, but strangely unnecessary. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the routines of captivity settled and the initial shock of imprisonment faded, the prisoners began to notice details that had not seemed important at first, because their expectations had prepared them for resistance rather than permission. Gates were present, fences were intact, and guards still existed, yet the intensity they had anticipated never fully materialized. Awareness of this difference grew slowly, shaped not by a single moment, but by repeated observation over time, during work details and daily movement inside the camp. The prisoners began to realize that supervision followed a predictable pattern rather than an aggressive one. Guards remained visible, but not intrusive, and boundaries were enforced through routine instead of constant pressure. The environment felt controlled, yet oddly unchallenging, as though it relied on compliance rather than fear to function. This realization introduced a quiet contradiction. Escape had always been imagined as a sudden act carried out under extreme risk, requiring speed, secrecy, and immediate consequence. What the prisoners were now facing was different. The possibility of leaving did not present itself as danger, but as absence. No alarm sounded. No heightened patrols appeared. Nothing seemed designed to provoke urgency. At first, this absence was interpreted cautiously. Many assumed that the system was deliberately understated, that control existed beyond what could be seen, and that any attempt to leave would trigger consequences too severe to be displayed openly. The calm itself was unsettling because it offered no clear signal of where the line truly lay. As days passed without incident, the prisoners began to recognize that leaving the camp was not physically impossible in the way they had imagined. Certain paths were left unwatched for long periods. Gates were closed but not constantly observed. The landscape beyond the wire did not appear immediately hostile or inaccessible. These observations accumulated quietly, reshaping how captivity was understood on a practical level. Yet the awareness of possibility did not translate into action. Instead, it created hesitation. The absence of immediate resistance made the decision to leave more complex, because without clear danger, the consequences became harder to predict. Escape was no longer a test of courage alone, but a calculation made in uncertainty. What complicated matters further was the lack of urgency from those enforcing captivity. Guards did not behave as though escape was expected or feared. There was no visible tension in their routines, no sense of anticipation. This confidence suggested that the system did not depend on constant vigilance to remain intact, and that the prisoner's compliance was assumed rather than demanded. Within this environment, the idea of leaving began to lose its simplicity. Escape no longer meant outrunning pursuit. It meant stepping into a space without instruction, without support, and without clarity about what would follow. The risk was no longer immediate punishment, but the unknown conditions beyond the camp, where familiarity and routine would vanish entirely. Some prisoners quietly discussed these possibilities, not in plans or strategies, but in cautious reflections. The conversations were brief and measured, shaped by uncertainty rather than excitement. Leaving no longer felt like a decisive act. It felt like a separation from the only structure that remained predictable. Over time, the prisoners began to understand that captivity had created a paradox. The camp restricted movement, yet provided stability. Beyond its boundaries lay freedom, but also uncertainty without guidance. In this context, the choice to stay did not feel like submission. It felt like a rational response to an environment where control had been replaced by quiet expectation. By the end of this phase, the prisoners had not rejected escape. They had redefined it. Leaving was no longer a matter of opportunity alone, but of psychological readiness. And for many, that readiness never arrived, because captivity had transformed escape from an act of courage into a decision burdened by uncertainty rather than fear. As the possibility of leaving remained present without being acted upon, the prisoners gradually became aware that hesitation was no longer an individual condition, but something shared quietly across the camp. What had begun as private uncertainty started to appear in collective behavior, not through discussion or agreement, but through patterns that repeated themselves without coordination. Men continued their routines with consistency, yet the absence of movement beyond the camp boundaries became noticeable precisely because it was so complete. No sudden disappearances occurred. No alarms were triggered. Days passed without any sign that escape had even been attempted. This continuity carried meaning, because in an environment defined by observation, inaction itself became a signal. The prisoners began to read this signal carefully. Each man noticed that others remained in place despite the same opportunities he had observed. Pads stayed empty. Gates were left untouched. The quiet persistence of these choices created a sense of collective restraint, reinforcing the idea that staying was not an isolated decision, but an unspoken norm forming in real time. This shift did not arise from fear of punishment, because no evidence suggested that consequences would be immediate or severe. Instead, it emerged from shared uncertainty. Leaving required stepping into conditions that no one fully understood. And as long as no one else moved first, uncertainty felt heavier than confinement. The absence of examples made hesitation self-reinforcing. Over time, the camp developed a rhythm shaped by mutual observation rather than authority. Prisoners adjusted their expectations based on what others did not do, and silence became a form of communication. Without a single word spoken, the collective behavior of staying in place conveyed a message more powerful than instruction. Leaving was possible, but not necessary. This unspoken agreement altered how freedom itself was perceived. Escape had once been imagined as a universal desire, something any prisoner would pursue instinctively. Now, the lack of action suggested a more complex reality. Freedom no longer appeared as a single objective shared equally by all, but as a decision weighed differently by each individual within a collective context. What made this dynamic particularly strong was its subtlety. There were no leaders encouraging restraint and no discussions framing staying as the correct choice. The behavior emerged naturally, shaped by proximity and shared conditions. Each man's decision reinforced the next, creating a quiet consensus without intention. As this pattern solidified, the psychological distance between the camp and the outside world grew. Leaving no longer felt like a return to normal life, but like a departure from a system that, however restrictive, had become familiar and predictable. The camp offered structure, food, routine, and relative safety, while the outside world remained abstract and undefined. Within this context, staying began to feel less like surrender and more like alignment. The prisoners were not bound by force, yet they remained bound by shared hesitation. The collective choice not to leave created stability within the camp, even as it limited the meaning of freedom beyond it. By the end of this stage, the absence of escape attempts had transformed from coincidence into expectation. The prisoners did not announce this shift, but they lived within it. Staying had become the default, reinforced daily by the knowledge that everyone else was doing the same. And in that quiet consensus, captivity revealed one of its most unexpected dimensions. Control did not require walls alone. It could exist through shared uncertainty, maintained not by guards or fences, but by a collective decision to remain where meaning and routine still existed. As the absence of escape attempts continued and the collective decision to stay quietly solidified, the prisoners began to experience a subtle but profound reversal in how they perceived the space around them. Because the camp, once defined purely as a place of confinement, started to acquire qualities that felt stabilizing rather than restrictive. This shift did not occur through comfort or kindness, but through predictability, which slowly reshaped how risk was understood. Inside the camp, life followed a rhythm that, while limited, remained reliable. Meals arrived at known times. Work details followed established patterns. Nights ended without disruption, and mornings began without sudden uncertainty. Nothing about this routine offered freedom, but it offered continuity, and continuity reduced the mental effort required to survive day after day. Beyond the fences, by contrast, everything felt undefined. The prisoners had little concrete information about what awaited them outside the camp boundaries. Roads led into unfamiliar towns. Civilians followed routines they did not understand. Language, customs, and expectations remained opaque. The outside world represented freedom, but also exposure, responsibility, and isolation without guidance. This contrast slowly altered how the prisoners evaluated risk. Escape was no longer measured against punishment alone, but against the loss of structure. Leaving meant abandoning a system where needs were predictable in exchange for a reality that demanded constant decision-making without support. For men who had lived under rigid organization for years, this prospect carried its own form of danger. The camp also provided a social framework that reduced uncertainty. Within its boundaries, relationships had settled into recognizable patterns. Faces were familiar. Roles, however informal, had become established. Even silence followed a rhythm that could be anticipated. Outside, none of these anchors existed. Freedom implied solitude and self-reliance at a moment when both felt psychologically costly. What reinforced this perception was the behavior of the guards themselves. Their calm, unhurried routines suggested confidence rather than vigilance. They did not behave as though the camp existed on the edge of collapse, nor did they display urgency about preventing escape. This demeanor communicated, without words, that the system was stable and that remaining within it carried no immediate threat. Over time, the prisoners began to interpret the camp not as a trap to be fled, but as a controlled environment that minimized unpredictability. The fences did not merely restrict movement. They marked the boundary between known conditions and unknown ones. Within those boundaries, life was constrained but intelligible. Beyond them, freedom came without instruction. This psychological shift did not erase the desire for liberty, but it reframed it. Freedom ceased to be an urgent goal and became a distant concept weighed against daily survival. The camp offered a form of passive security, where decisions were limited and consequences predictable. Leaving required confronting a world that demanded initiative at a time when initiative felt burdensome rather than empowering. As days turned into weeks, the idea of escape lost its emotional intensity. It remained theoretically possible, but practically unappealing. The camp had become a place where uncertainty was managed rather than confronted, and that management carried value. Staying was no longer simply easier. It felt safer. By this stage, captivity had reversed its meaning in a subtle way. The place designed to confine now offered protection from a reality that felt overwhelming in its openness. The prisoners were not choosing comfort over freedom. They were choosing clarity over ambiguity, structure over exposure, and familiarity over risk. In this environment, the decision to remain no longer required justification. It aligned naturally with the conditions of daily life. The camp had become the reference point against which all other options were measured, not because it was ideal, but because it was understandable. And in that understanding, captivity revealed one of its most unexpected transformations. The fences no longer symbolized danger alone. They marked the edge of a world where everything made sense, separating it from a freedom that demanded more than many were ready to give. As the camp gradually came to feel safer than the unknown beyond its boundaries, the prisoners reached a point where hesitation was no longer the defining factor in their behavior. What replaced it was something quieter and more deliberate, because remaining inside the camp stopped being a temporary response to uncertainty and became an internal decision shaped by reflection rather than fear. By this stage, the absence of escape attempts could no longer be explained by coincidence or sheer doubt alone. Time had passed without disruption. Opportunities had appeared without consequence, and yet nothing changed. The prisoners began to recognize that staying was not merely what happened when escape felt risky, but what occurred when captivity had become psychologically manageable. This realization altered how they understood their own choices. Remaining inside the camp no longer felt like passivity or submission. It felt intentional, even if that intention was never spoken aloud. The men had assessed their situation, compared the stability of the camp to the ambiguity beyond it, and quietly concluded that the cost of leaving outweighed its promise. What made this decision particularly complex was that it did not remove longing or resolve the contradiction between freedom and confinement. Instead, it placed those ideas in balance. Freedom existed as an abstract ideal, while the camp existed as a lived reality. One demanded courage and constant judgment. The other demanded adaptation and endurance. Over time, endurance felt more achievable. Within this framework, the prisoners' identities began to adjust. They were no longer men waiting for an opportunity to flee, nor were they men resigned to permanent captivity. They occupied an intermediate state where remaining made sense in the present, even if the future remained uncertain. Staying became a strategy rather than a failure of will. Daily life reinforced this choice. Routine continued to provide clarity. Social relationships remained intact. Needs were met predictably. Even discomfort followed familiar patterns. Leaving would have meant dismantling all of this at once, stepping into a world that offered no guidance and no immediate support. The mental effort required to rebuild life from nothing felt heavier than enduring confinement as it existed. This internal decision did not require agreement or coordination. Each man reached it independently, yet the result appeared collective. The camp remained full not because escape was impossible, but because leaving no longer aligned with how the prisoners evaluated risk, meaning, and survival. The shared outcome masked the individual reasoning that led to it. Over time, the distinction between choice and circumstance blurred. The prisoners did not feel trapped, yet they did not feel free. They lived within a structure they had learned to navigate, one that demanded restraint but offered predictability. In this environment, remaining became the path of least resistance, not because it was easier, but because it preserved coherence in a life already reduced to essentials. As this mindset settled, escape ceased to occupy the center of thought. It did not vanish, but it moved to the margins, replaced by attention to daily tasks and immediate concerns. The prisoners adapted not by abandoning the idea of freedom, but by postponing it indefinitely, allowing the present to dominate decision-making. By the end of this phase, staying no longer required justification. It had become the default expression of a calculated response to uncertainty. The prisoners were not immobilized by fear or controlled by force. They were guided by an internal logic shaped by experience, routine, and the quiet understanding that survival sometimes meant choosing the familiar over the possible. And in that choice, captivity reached its most subtle form. The men remained behind the fences not because they could not leave, but because leaving demanded a version of themselves that no longer felt accessible. The camp had reshaped their relationship with freedom, turning it from an urgent goal into a distant concept deferred by the practical need to endure. By the time the prisoners fully recognized that they could leave and yet remained where they were, captivity had ceased to operate as a simple condition imposed from the outside. It had become an internal landscape shaped by familiarity, adaptation, and the quiet recalibration of what freedom meant under prolonged uncertainty. The fences still stood, and the camp remained unchanged in form, but their meaning had shifted. They no longer represented an urgent barrier to be overcome, but a boundary that separated what was known from what was unknowable. Inside lay routine, predictability, and a life reduced to manageable dimensions. Outside lay possibility, but also responsibility, isolation, and the demand to rebuild without guidance. What kept the prisoners in place was not fear of punishment or the illusion that escape was impossible. It was the weight of decision itself. Leaving required a decisive break from everything that had become stable, and stability, however limited, carried its own form of security. Staying did not feel heroic, but it felt coherent in a world where coherence had become scarce. Over time, the absence of escape no longer felt like a failure or a contradiction. It became a reflection of how captivity reshaped priorities. Survival was no longer defined by movement toward freedom, but by maintaining balance within constraint. The prisoners did not abandon the idea of liberty. They postponed it, allowing the present to dominate choices that once would have been driven by instinct. In this way, captivity revealed one of its most complex truths. Control does not always rely on force or confinement alone. It can exist through adaptation, through the gradual alignment of behavior with conditions that reduce uncertainty and minimize risk. Freedom remained visible, but it no longer pulled with the same urgency it once had. The men who stayed behind the wire were not defeated by circumstance in any simple sense. They were shaped by it. The camp had become a place where life, however restricted, made sense, and leaving meant surrendering that sense for a future that offered no guarantees. And so, when the gates remained closed and the paths beyond them went untouched, it was not because escape had failed to present itself. It was because captivity had quietly transformed the meaning of choice itself, leaving the prisoners suspended between freedom and familiarity, where remaining felt less like surrender and more like the only decision that allowed life to continue without unraveling. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.